off, I just want to say I'm really excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here with everyone, and to be part of this program with Aish and the Thornhill Shul. It's really an honor to be able to be a part of this. The So if you wanted to hear a little bit about the firm, yeah. So the what we both David and I were observant, and um, we both live in Thornhill, and we were both working downtown. That was in the before times when people worked downtown, and um, we were doing a lot of work that was interesting to us, but it wasn't fulfilling in the way that we had hoped. The type of work that we wanted to do would be fulfilling, and it occurred to us that that maybe we wanted to join forces and bring about a new law firm, a different take on the traditional moderate law school law firm that we had been, that we had risen through, and really focus our efforts on contributing in a meaningful way to the Jewish community, the pro-Israel community, and more broadly, just the general community, with folks that are facing challenges, facing very serious life challenges, and how to get them through that. And we have been so pleasantly surprised that there is a great deal of work to be done in these communities to work alongside these communities to try to achieve positive, meaningful change for our communities. And so when we started back in April 2019, we started right away, and we were able to work with a lot of really great organizations, community organizations like B'nai B'rith, like Hasbara, Lawfare Project in the States, and we hit the ground running. One of our first cases was a Supreme Court challenge on behalf of B'nai B'rith, and that was in relation to a claim against B'nai B'rith by a gentleman named Dimitri Lascaris, who, for those that have been tracking Anti-Israel lawfare, would likely be familiar with him. We continued on and worked on the Sagat wine labeling matter in Israel, which I'm happy to talk about.
Sure, tell us about that.
Yeah, we finally managed to get an exciting ruling very recently, and I'll get a little bit more into that. But we were approached to get involved in that case, and we brought a motion to get involved with a very troubling lower court decision in the federal court, which said that labeling wines in Canada as products of Israel, when they are in fact produced in Judea and Samaria, that would be viewed by the court as misleading, false and misleading. And so naturally, we thought that was ridiculous, and we got involved. And now it is heading to the Federal Court of Appeal, which is very exciting. And Sagat is now going to be arguing. We will be arguing on behalf of Sagat at the Federal Court of Appeal to make the case that Sagat wines are products of Israel. There's no question about it.
So tell us about the significance. I know we're starting a little bit, specific here, but since you mentioned it, so what is in your mind, when you're someone sitting at home and saying, okay, you basically have a winery, within Judea and Samaria, sort of the West Bank, and essentially, as I understand it, it was not allowed to be labeled as made in Israel here in Canada. According to what regulations? What was the party that made those regulations?
Sure. So, this is an interesting case. Just so you know, like a lot of anti-Israel lawfare efforts, this was brought about because a gentleman by the name of Kattenberg, who is a Winnipeg. A gentleman from Winnipeg, visited Israel, went to this winery, and noticed that these were being marketed as products of Israel. So he complained to the LCBO, and he complained to, I believe it was the Food Inspection Agency. and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and said these wines are not produced in Israel, they're produced in the occupied Palestinian territories. And LCBO, from what I recall, LCBO agreed to clear it off their shelf, and the Food Inspection Agency made a determination that that they weren't products of Israel. That was reversed, ultimately led to a review brought by Kattenberg to the court, and it led to a pretty nasty ruling by a judge of the federal court, who said that labeling West Bank wines, for lack of a better term, is false and misleading, and therefore this issue needs to go back to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency to redetermine the matter. So that's how this all emanated. And when we saw that ruling, I think we, like many people in the Jewish and pro-Israel community, were very concerned. I mean, the implications of a federal court decision that says that labeling wines that come from Greater Israel as products of Israel is false and misleading. Well, I absolutely don't agree with that. You know, I mean, it couldn't be further from the truth, right? Wines that come from Judea and Samaria, it's the land of Israel. Israeli nationals make it. They pay Israeli taxes, Israeli electric, etc. These are the types of arguments that we brought forth to the Federal Court of Appeal. And the Federal Court of Appeal said, well, you know what? We're going to let you make submissions on this in the higher court. And so that's what we're going to be doing once it manages to get there. But at the heart of this matter, what we're really dealing with is an increasing onslaught of anti-Israel litigation efforts, efforts to use the courts to obtain favorable rulings, and to use the courts in an effort to further the BDS campaign, the anti-Israel campaign across the world. And you're seeing this in many other countries. Sagat Winery was involved in a case in the European Union. You're seeing this in Europe. You're seeing this in other places across the world, and it's becoming a very problematic issue. And that's why lawyers, there are increasingly more lawyers that are starting to get more involved in pushing back against this type of stuff, because it is quite troubling.
And so tell us about the significance then, you know, both in a legal and in sort of a political realm, you know, to this being successful. In other words, that Sagat being able to label itself in Canada, either as part of Israel or not. Like what I mean, obviously for those of us who are sort of watching, or those who are, you know, certainly, you know, pro-Israel and consider, you know, Judea and Samaria to be part of Israel, we consider a moral matter. But what's this sort of the practical, legal, or political significance to it?
You know, I think part of our role is, of course, to take on these challenges, but also to take a step back and think objectively about the bigger picture, right? What does it mean when a court finds that a product that emanates from Greater Israel, for, again, these are all very charged terms, that they are not products of Israel? That's a very troubling ruling, potentially, because first of all, it provides a basis for a basis for and a foothold for BDS efforts, because it can always be pointed to as a basis, as grounding the BDS campaign, and so if you look a little bit deeper, what you find is that, well, if this one subset of products cannot be labeled products of Israel because they are outside of particular borders, again, that are all quite political and very difficult to determine and are all subject to negotiation and conflict, then that can be extended to many, if not most, Israeli products. And you see that in the wider BDS campaign. There's a conflation between where the campaign is targeted, right? So if anybody watches the BDS campaign, the global anti-Israel campaign, what you find is on the one hand, you see, well, there's challenges um, against Israel's presence in certain areas outside of the 67 borders. Well, that's one problem. But then if you look deeper, you find that, well, there's also even companies that don't have a foothold outside the 1967 borders, they're also pursued because, of course, if you're an Israeli company, you somehow promulgate the occupation, and so really every single Israeli could be affected by a ruling like this, because I hate slippery slopes, but it is kind of true that if you start with companies like Sagat, it becomes harder and harder to, if you don't fight Sagat, to fight against campaigns against Tel Aviv companies, because Israeli companies inside the 67 borders are viewed as objectionable by the worldwide BDS campaign. So I think that Sagat is really the front line, and that's how we view it. So from a practical perspective, this is a far wider campaign than one small winery on a hilltop somewhere outside the 67 borders. This really could have far-reaching applications far beyond this one thing, and that's why I think people are so passionate about it, because they've seen over the years the rolling goalposts. They see that they hear about, well, there's occupied territory, but then they hear about Israelis and they hear about Israeli soldiers, and well, everybody's an Israeli. I mean, anybody over the age of majority in Israel is like has been in the war. It has been part of the army or been enlisted, whatever it is. So the goalposts are super wide, and it's really about taking the fight and being proactive than waiting for it to reach your shores.
Right. So I guess what you're saying is, we're sort of, the way you're approaching this is really that, Sagot is really the low hanging fruit. It's the easy target. But, ultimately, if a precedent is set either way in terms of that, that they're able to determine the borders here, then all of a sudden, everything becomes fair game.
That's true. And also, what business of it is a Canadian courts in determining Israel's ultimate borders? I mean, I can think of many people that would be far more suited than a judge of the federal court to determine Israel's borders. And so, again, this is a far broader discussion. Courts are loath to get involved in political issues, but unfortunately, in this case, the court did get dragged into a political issue, into what, in my view, is an attempt to bring the BDS campaign into our court system. And unfortunately, that resulted in a unfavorable ruling, which we're working towards overturning.
So not to spend too much time on this one case, but every time, I think we'll move on, you say something interesting I want to ask you about. You say that, the courts, are loath to sort of get involved in political, in the muck of, politics or political disputes. So let me ask you, to speculate here, which I'm sure you wouldn't love to do, but I'll ask you anyway. Why would they get involved in it? Why would they sort of consider this? I'm not familiar with the legal term, but why would they consider that this individual, Winnipeg, who complained, had standing and they heard it anyway? Why wouldn't they just say, sort of, this is not our bailiwick? Why did they decide to engage themselves in such a hot potato, not just a political, but the Middle East of all things?
It's a great question, and it would be difficult for me to answer as to why it showed up in front of unfortunately, there are advantages and disadvantages to the way our court system is built. One of the advantages is that there's a great deal of access to justice. Depends who you ask. That's always a hot topic in the justice system. But anybody can file anything at any time against anyone. Now, that's not going to provide any comfort to the folks that are watching this webcast, but it really is true. The court is accessible, and you can raise your issues. Ultimately, that issue, if it's not stopped in its tracks on a procedural basis, it could very well find its way before a judge. And the judge then needs to take a hard look at the materials and make a decision. That's why we have redress and why we have an established justice system. So uh, the review of this matter, I think, was appropriate. Um, I disagree with the ultimate finding, but and the reasoning behind that finding, but ultimately I do believe that I I'm not in the business of shutting down potentially meritorious claims. And so if someone has a claim to be brought to the court should hear it and determine it on its merits. But I agree with you, when you actually think about it, you wonder, how did this end up finding its way in front of a judge and then ultimately being decided upon? It seems like a bit of a ludicrous issue, but ultimately it was brought appropriately and the judge had to make a decision. Unfortunately, we don't agree with the decision, and we're working to overturn it. But thankfully, I think we have a system that allows people to bring complaints, even if they're ultimately determined to be frivolous. I'd much prefer that those matters be brought ahead, and of course, we have mechanisms to disincentivize folks from being potentially unmeritorious claims. But again, we need to think about it from the broader perspective. And I think you're right. The challenge here is there are increasingly more claims being brought that raise BDS matters. And so the question is, how are we going to deal with them? Well, we can't really prevent people from bringing claims, but what we can do is build up resources uh, and people in the legal profession that are engaged and prepared to take on these types of fights, so that ultimately these types of claims are not successful.
So tell us a little bit about, sort of backing up on this, really this concept of lawfare in general that you're involved with. It seems to me that we've only really been hearing about this, in the last few years. Again, I could be wrong, and certainly this is anecdotal, but um, you know, using the law to sort of push back against, against the boycott movement. The boycott movement's been around for, 15 years or so. In your experience, how long? And again, I don't know. There are some individuals who are doing it, on behalf of an anti-Israel organization or on behalf of the boycott movement against Israel, and there are other individuals who just do it, as individuals who, have a bone to pick with Israel or an Israeli policy. But this concept of anti-Israel organizations using the law, and conversely, the pro-Israel movement using the law as well. How long has this been going on? I mean, has this been going on for 15, 20 years? Because anecdotally, to me, it seems like 5 years ago we hear about Jarat Hadin and the Lawfare Project, and you and your colleague David. This is all in the last few years, if I'm not mistaken. What has really spurred this?
I think that I think that um, I think there's a momentum. I think that there is increasingly a frustration with alternate means of addressing these types of issues. I think that's felt on both sides. I don't think that's unique to the pro-Israel and Jewish communities. Um, I think that there is a feeling that um, you know we've fought and continue to be fighting the battle on what I think is typically the main frontier, which is campus, and certainly online is another frontier, but that is just so unwieldy, it's hard to fight. Um, and there's a lot of frustration that that administrations don't address these types of things in a meaningful way, campus administrations. And so what ends up happening is that people are looking for alternate venues. Um, I know that there have always been smart, um, passionate lawyers, and that's the case across Jewish history, but in particular over the last century or so, um, that were groundbreaking in fighting on behalf of Jewish and pro-Israel rights, and so I think that's always been a thing. I think that the focus has now shifted on the BDS movement, pro-Israel or anti-Israel campaigns, and how to find ways to, one, proactively fight against these types of efforts, and two, to defend against efforts to demonize Israel, harm or potentially harm Israeli companies, or ultimately the state and its people. So there seems to be momentum, and there's been a lot of really great work done by groups like Shurat Hadin, ILF, many Jewish organizations in Canada, which, that goes without saying, B'nai B'rith, CIJA, all of these types of groups, Hasbara, there's always been an effort to look to the courts for ways to benefit the community. But there really has been an increase. And I think it's really just a matter of momentum. People are finding that they are getting results from the court system. And so they're looking for new ways to bring additional matters there.
Right. Now, this is interesting because, we talked about, the pro-Israel side sort of using lawfare to fight against injustice. And one of the things that, we've seen as well, and obviously what we were talking about for the last little while with Sagat is, it's, so to speak, the anti-Israel movement cause, side, however you want to call that, using that as well. How would you characterize their sophistication, if you want to call it that, in this realm? Are there, is there like the bizarro Aaron Rosenberg out there? I'm not asking for you to say names, but how sort of active and organized, it's a Seinfeld reference for those of you, how active and organized, so to speak, is the anti-Israel cause, when it comes to this kind of, lawfare litigation and so on? Have they gotten their act together too? Are they well funded and well armed, the way that some of these Jewish organizations are, or where do they fit in your estimation? Because you're not fighting against a vacuum here.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I think that's a good question. And just to backtrack really quickly, because I think that's an interesting question. I just wanted to backtrack and say, back to the momentum thing. It occurred to me as you were asking my question that, there have been some real milestones for the Canadian pro-Israel community. And Rob, you are one to thank for that, because of your human rights complaint. That was a real game changer for a lot of us. I was in law school at the time, but I was really inspired by that, because I said, oh wait, something can really be done. People are willing to stand up and bring their matters to a legal forum. So kudos to you. And that just goes to the point that, it's really momentum. Once one person stands up and says they'll be counted, many others do. And so just going to your question about, are we on the same playing field? Where do we stand? What's the current status? I fear that, like I said earlier, with respect to increased efforts to bring these matters in front of the court and bring it to the judicial system, I think that there is an increasing there's an increasing interest from organizations, from donors, from community members to find alternate avenues, which would include the justice system. And I think that's the case on both sides. So the challenge is, where do we stand today? I think we're still at the relative infancy of the BDS coming to court, but I fully anticipate that this is the next frontier. Campus was the newest frontier 10, 15 years ago, and it continues to be so today, even though campuses are basically shut down now, but the threat has not gone away. And that's another case we can talk about, where I was assisting with the Charut event and all of that back a year ago when there was a riot because they dared to bring former soldiers on campus. So I fear that the court is the new frontier, and I think it is a legal claim, meritorious or not, is a great rallying cry. It is a great way to fundraise, and it is a great way to demonstrate that you appear to be taking concrete steps to further your particular campaign. So I think that we're seeing that in the BDS. I monitor this quite regularly, and I'm finding that there is an increased sophistication on the legal frontier, and every day they're working harder and harder. And I believe that the BDS campaign is extremely well organized. I think that's one thing that we can give the BDS campaign, and they know what works and what doesn't. And I fear that, as I said before, the new frontier, additional resources will be allocated towards legal actions because they are just so weighty, even if they're meritorious, or if they're meritorious or not. They appear they appear to be a serious threat. And so a good example is the International Criminal Court's investigations of Israel's conduct in past conflicts. And we don't know what the result is. There's been some developments recently, but the idea of the International Criminal Court investigating the state of Israel for its conduct during wartime, that just sounds weighty. That sounds hefty. It sounds like something extremely serious is happening, and that potentially there will be a damning result against Israel. And that sort of narrative arc, those risks, that marquee is very appetizing for the BDS movement. And any opportunity to make it appear as though Jewish or pro-Israel groups or Israel is under threat or is embroiled in some sort of trouble, that is all good for the BDS campaign.
Well, so tell us about, you mentioned that this is, on the other side, they're really getting their act together as well. You talked about Sagat, the winery. What other cases, have you been working on in this? You mentioned, Harut at York University last year. Tell us a little bit about, that, how you're involved. I didn't realize that was something you were involved with. Tell us about that.
Sure. So, one thing that both David and I, were part of Hasbra at York, and we were very involved with all the all of the issues that Jewish and pro-Israel students were facing on campus at York, which it's fair to say that it was at a certain point in time was probably the most troubling campus in Canada when it came to anti-Israel activism. And we came up through that system. And so we have a special place in our heart for Jewish and pro-Israel students who are combating this type of stuff on campus. And so what we've made a concerted effort to do is to reach out to these students early on and say, we have you, we're here. If you ever need anything from us, you reach out to us, you let us know, and we will be there. And we know as students how powerful that is, because often we were faced with concerns, and we had issues that came up from time to time, whether there was assault or harassment or whatever else it was. And we felt at times like we didn't have anyone to turn to. And so having that resource would have been great. So as a way of paying it forward, we try to do that as well. And that's how we connected with a young woman named Lauren Isaacs. And she was the head of an organization called Harut Canada. It was a student organization. It was unapologetically Zionist. And naturally, those two words inspired me. And I knew that they were bringing former soldiers to campus. And I knew that it was going to be an issue. So we reached out to her early and said, if you ever need anything or something comes up or whatever, you just feel free to reach out to us and we'll help out. Well, the day came, and on November 19th of 2019, Harut held their event. And of course, many of us know that there was a violent riot that took place outside of the event. And of course, all that Herut did was commit the sin of inviting former IDF soldiers, which basically classifies almost half of the Israeli population, if not almost all of it. And they viewed that as the anti-Israel student groups viewed that as objectionable. And there was some violence, there was a lot of anger, and ultimately what the university, York University, in its wisdom, in its great chachma, they decided that they were going to take action. So what was the first thing they did? They decided that not only were they going to sanction the anti-Israel group that promoted this violent event, but they were going to do the same. So they were going to issue some rough justice against both the anti-Israel group and Herut for holding the event. Now, that type of reaction from an administration, while not unsurprising, was deeply troubling for us from an academic freedom perspective, from a free speech perspective, and ultimately for, it just felt like victim blaming and victim shaming. They wanted to put on an event about providing a forum for free speech at a university, in a main university center, and they were shut down. And that was deeply problematic to us. But most offensive to us was the idea that Herut was going to be stripped of its privileges for the sin of hosting an event that was targeted by anti-Israel protesters. So we immediately got involved. We called for an immediate meeting with the administration. We had a meeting with the administration, and we basically said we would not be leaving until they received, or full privileges were returned to Herut as a student group. And by the end of the day, they had returned those privileges, and we were very proud of Herut for standing their ground, and I was deeply upset with the administration's bungling of this situation. That ultimately led to an independent review by former Supreme Court Justice Cromwell. We made submissions to him. He came out with a report. They're implementing a number of his recommendations to improve student safety and security at York. So we're looking forward to that, and we're hoping that those are going to provide some meaningful positives for Jewish and pro-Israel students. But ultimately, we were just, we were pleased to be able to be part of helping a small, independent, pro-Israel student group fight against an injustice. And it really was a David and Goliath type fight, because when you're talking about a very small student group with limited resources against York University, probably the most well-funded university in the country, the odds are really stacked against you. So it was a pleasure to work on that case. And that's the type of work that we really want to be doing. We want to be helping helping out in these types of David and Goliath type fights, where we're leveling the playing field for students that would otherwise be railroaded. And we've experienced that in our student days, and we just want to ensure that doesn't happen again.
Right. Well, that's wonderful. And have an eye on the time here. I just really want to ask one question, and then this is from Tara, one of the participants here. You may have seen this well in the chat box, but asked if you have had any negative interactions with pro-BDS lawyers in Toronto. If so, how did you handle that?
I don't recall. I find that when you're dealing with matters in the justice system, it's not as, well, let's put it this way. On campus, interactions are somewhat no holds barred. When these matters enter the justice system, and they're dealt with by lawyers, the lawyers, are bound by certain rules of professional conduct, by traditions, by conventions, and there's a general duty to the administration of justice and candor with your fellow lawyers who are colleagues. So I would say that our interactions with lawyers that represent BDS groups, or anti-Israel groups, or whatever you want to call them, have generally been courteous. And while we disagree on what generally, we often disagree on the substance of the underlying matter. I have not seen any uncomfortable exchanges that were beyond the line, in my view. That's not to say that I don't anticipate that may happen in the future. I hope it doesn't, because I think that it's important to maintain the standards, the appropriate standards that the justice system has maintained for so long. I think that's very important, and I hope there's little, if any, erosion on those against those standards. But I can see a scenario where non-lawyers begin launching challenges, and when you're dealing with non-lawyers, that's when communications can be strained and where temperatures can rise. And I fear that could be a new forum, a new avenue for these types of matters. And in those cases, non-lawyers are not bound by those same duties and are not aware of those types of customs and traditions. And so I do fear that could happen in the future. But the short answer is, thankfully, all of our interactions with lawyers on the other side of these types of matters have been courteous, if not pleasant, from time to time.
Wonderful. Well, listen, I mean, in the interest of time, I'll let you go at that point. I mean, this has been fascinating, and I really do appreciate your time. Looks like you're still at the office, so we know no rest for the weary. So once again, thank you, Aaron Rosenberg of RE Law LLP, for joining us and sharing your expertise. I mean, I'm sure we could spend a great deal of time just asking about some of your cases. You really are, I think, at the forefront of it, certainly in this country. And so we thank you for for your service, and thank you everyone for joining us again. It has been recorded, so hopefully at some point next week it'll be sent out to the list on the H. Thornhill Community Shul. So once again, thank you everyone for joining us, and have a good evening.
Thank you.